My ex-husband and his family spent 5 years blaming me for draining our savings. When I finally sued them for defamation, they were forced to open the bank records. The moment the audit revealed he secretly moved funds to his private account entirely alone, their lies collapsed. If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do and watched people believe it without question, this story might feel familiar. Welcome back to Van's Rock Stories. Sometimes losing a marriage isn't the hardest part. Sometimes the hardest part is watching other people tell your story for you. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, would you stay silent if someone spent years damaging your reputation, or would you fight back? And if you enjoy stories about betrayal, justice, and real-life consequences, don't forget to subscribe. My name is Olivia Bennett. I'm 35 years old, and for almost 5 years, I've been carrying a reputation I never deserved. From the outside, my life looked fine. I was an architect. I had steady work, my own home, and a routine that made everything seem normal. Most people would have looked at me and assumed I'd moved on from my divorce. They would have been wrong. 5 years earlier, my marriage to Ethan Walker ended. That part wasn't unusual. What happened afterward was. According to Ethan and his family, our financial problems had been my fault. They told people I had drained our savings chasing personal projects and career ambitions. The story spread faster than I ever expected. By the time I realized how many people believed it, correcting it felt impossible. I kept telling myself the rumors would fade. Instead, they settled into the community and stayed there. Nobody openly confronted me about it. Honestly, that would have been easier. Instead, it showed up in small ways. Conversations suddenly ending when I approached. People becoming strangely polite. Invitations that stopped arriving. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to remind me that some people had already decided who I was. Years earlier, I had been active in community projects and charity events. I knew a lot of people. Now, I mostly kept my distance. It was simpler that way. One afternoon, I ran into an old acquaintance named Carol at a coffee shop. We chatted for a few minutes about work and mutual friends. Then came the awkward pause, the kind I'd learned to recognize immediately. Carol looked down at her coffee. "I'm glad everything worked out after, you know." I gave a small smile. "Yeah, life goes on." Neither of us said what she really meant. We both knew. A few minutes later, we said goodbye. As I walked back to my car, I realized I was clenching my jaw. That had become a habit. Smile. Avoid the subject. Move on. Repeat. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived for a city charity gala. Normally, I would have declined. Large social events weren't exactly my favorite thing anymore. But this one mattered professionally. Several local developers and community leaders would be there, and I was trying to expand my firm's opportunities. So I bought a ticket and convinced myself it was just work. Nothing more. The night of the event, I almost talked myself out of going. Instead, I showed up, checked in, and focused on what I did best: work. For the first hour, things actually went well. I spoke with developers, exchanged business cards, had a promising conversation about a future community project. For the first time in a while, I felt myself relax. Maybe enough time had passed. Maybe people had finally moved on. Maybe I had spent years worrying about something that no longer mattered. Then I felt it. That strange feeling that someone was watching me. I ignored it at first. A few minutes later, it happened again. I turned and looked across the ballroom, and there she was. Diane Walker, my former mother-in-law, the woman who had spent years telling anyone who would listen that I had ruined her son's future. She stood near one of the sponsor tables holding a glass in one hand, not speaking, not smiling, just staring directly at me. And when our eyes met, she didn't look away. Diane and I stared at each other across the ballroom. 5 years. That was how long it had been since we'd spoken. I'd seen pictures of her online from time to time. Church events, community fundraisers, mutual acquaintances posting photos. Seeing her in person felt different. She still carried the same certainty she'd always had. The certainty that she was right. I looked away first and forced myself back into the conversation. A developer named Martin was talking about a community recreation project. I nodded, asked a few questions, and tried to focus. A few minutes later, I noticed Diane walking through the crowd, toward me. Great. By then, only Martin and a woman named Rebecca were standing nearby. Rebecca smiled. "So, Olivia, how long have you been with your firm?" "Almost 7 years. I heard great things about the Eastwood renovation." "Thank you." Then her attention shifted past my shoulder. I already knew why. "Olivia." I turned. "Diane." The atmosphere changed immediately. Not hostile, just uncomfortable. Diane smiled politely. "It's been a long time." "It has." "You look well." "So do you." Neither of us meant much by it. She glanced at Martin and Rebecca. "Olivia used to be part of our family." Rebecca straightened slightly. "Oh." There it was. The curiosity. The moment the conversation stopped being normal. "My son and Olivia were married for several years," Diane continued. "That's true," I said. For a second I thought she might leave it there. Instead, she laughed softly. "You know how life is. Financial problems can change everything." Martin shifted awkwardly. Rebecca suddenly seemed very interested in her drink. I knew exactly what Diane was doing. She never made direct accusations. She didn't have to. She simply left enough hints for everyone else to fill in the blanks. "Diane, I think we're both here for the fundraiser." Her smile tightened. "Of course." Then she tilted her head. "You always were good at changing the subject." A couple nearby glanced in our direction. People were listening now. Not openly, just enough. I recognized one woman from a local business association. Years ago, she'd suddenly stopped responding to emails about a community project. At the time, I'd assumed she was busy. Standing there, I wasn't so sure anymore. Rebecca cleared her throat. "I should go say hello to someone." She left. Martin followed a few seconds later. Now it was just Diane and me. She watched them walk away before turning back to me. "You seem upset." I laughed once. "Do I?" "People remember things, Olivia." There was no smile this time. Just confidence. The same confidence she'd carried for 5 years. As if repeating a story long enough made it true. Around us, the fundraiser continued. Music played, conversations carried on. But I could feel people watching. Diane glanced toward a nearby group of guests and raised her voice just enough to be overheard. "Some wounds never fully heal." I stared at her. She shook her head sympathetically. "Especially when a family loses its future." A few conversations nearby slowed. Then she looked directly at me. After all, not everyone recovers when someone spends the savings they spent their whole lives building. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The people closest to us pretended not to be listening, which usually means they're listening very carefully. 5 years ago, that comment would have ruined my evening. I would have defended myself, explained, argued, tried to convince people she was wrong. Instead, I found myself looking at Diane with an odd sense of calm. Not because her words didn't bother me. They did. But I was suddenly tired of having the same argument. I picked up my glass. "Diane, can I ask you something?" She seemed surprised. "Of course." I nodded. "What proof did you ever have?" Her expression didn't change. "What? What proof?" I kept my voice even. "You've been telling people for years that I drained our savings. Ethan said it. You repeated it. Other people repeated it." I paused. "What was the actual proof?" The question hung there. Simple. Direct. For the first time that evening, Diane didn't answer immediately. Around us, a few conversations had gone quiet. Not completely. Just enough that people could hear if they wanted to. Diane crossed her arms. Ethan told us what happened. That's not proof. Her jaw tightened slightly. He showed us enough. Enough of what? Now she looked irritated. The financial situation your marriage ended with. I nodded slowly. Did you ever see bank records? No answer. Did you ever see account statements? She looked away briefly, then back at me. I trusted my son. There it was. Not evidence. Trust. A story she believed because it came from Ethan. I wasn't even trying to embarrass her anymore. I genuinely wanted to know. For years, I'd assumed there was something Ethan had shown people behind the scenes. Some document, some report, some piece of information I never knew about. But standing there, listening to Diane struggle to answer a basic question, I started wondering if that evidence had never existed. The realization caught me off guard. Diane seemed to notice. Her voice sharpened. Are you saying Ethan lied? I shrugged slightly. I'm asking what evidence there was. She didn't answer. A man standing nearby suddenly found something fascinating on the opposite side of the room and walked away. Another guest looked down into her drink. Nobody wanted to be caught in the middle. The silence stretched a little longer than either of us expected. Finally, Diane shook her head. I know what happened to my family. I nodded. Maybe. That response seemed to bother her more than if I'd argued. She opened her mouth as if she wanted to continue, then stopped. For the first time all evening, she looked uncertain. Only for a second. But I noticed. Then she turned and walked away. Just like that. No final comment. No dramatic exit. She simply left. I stood there for a moment trying to process what had happened. The conversation hadn't gone the way I expected. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I'd expected. A few minutes later, Rebecca cautiously returned. Are you okay? I laughed. That's apparently the question of the night. She smiled. For what it's worth, you handled that better than I would have. Thanks. She hesitated, then lowered her voice. I've heard stories over the years. There it was again. Stories, not facts. Stories. But tonight felt... She searched for the right word. Different. Before I could respond, someone called her name from across the room. She gave me an apologetic smile and walked away. The fundraiser continued for another hour. I spoke to a few people, collected a handful of business cards, tried to focus on work, but my conversation with Diane kept replaying in my head. Not because of what she'd said, because of what she hadn't said. The evening eventually wound down. People began collecting coats and saying their goodbyes. I was heading toward the exit when I heard someone call my name. Olivia? I turned. A gray-haired man was standing a few feet away. It took me a second to recognize him. Tom? He smiled. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. Tom Harris. Years ago, we'd served together on a church community committee. I hadn't seen him since before my divorce. We exchanged a few polite words, talked briefly about work and mutual acquaintances. Then his expression changed. The smile faded. He glanced around as if making sure nobody was paying attention. Can I ask you something? Sure. He lowered his voice. Did Ethan ever handle all of your finances himself? I frowned. Mostly yes. Tom nodded slowly, as if confirming something. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether to continue. Then he looked directly at me. There's something about Ethan's finances that I don't think you ever knew. For a second, I just stared at Tom. What do you mean? He glanced toward the ballroom behind us. People were still leaving. A few guests lingered near the entrance, finishing conversations before heading home. Tom lowered his voice. I don't know much. Honestly, probably not enough to make any conclusions. That wasn't exactly reassuring. Then why say anything? He rubbed the back of his neck. Because years ago, before your divorce, Ethan asked me a few questions. What kind of questions? Investments. Private accounts. Moving money between different financial institutions. I frowned. Ethan worked in finance. I know. Tom nodded. Which is why I never thought much about it at the time. He hesitated. But tonight, hearing Diane talk the way she did, I started wondering. The answer felt incomplete. Maybe he sensed that. Look, Olivia, I'm not accusing him of anything. Okay. I'm just saying I remember conversations that seemed strange in hindsight. Before I could ask another question, someone called Tom's name from outside. His wife was waiting near the parking lot. Tom pulled a business card from his pocket. If you ever decide you want to talk about it, call me. I took the card. Then he left. The drive home felt longer than usual, not because of what Tom had actually said, because of what he hadn't. For years, I'd avoided thinking about my marriage any more than necessary. Divorce was painful enough. I didn't see the point of constantly reopening old wounds. But that night, my mind kept circling back to the same question. How much did I really know about our finances? The uncomfortable answer was less than I liked admitting. Ethan handled almost everything. Back then, that arrangement seemed normal. He worked in investments. I was busy building my architecture career. Whenever financial decisions came up, he usually already had a plan, a spreadsheet, a recommendation, an explanation. At the time, I saw it as teamwork. Now, I wasn't so sure. A few days later, I found myself digging through old storage boxes in a closet. Tax records, mortgage paperwork, insurance documents. The kind of paperwork nobody enjoys keeping. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I wasn't even sure what I expected to find. Mostly, I was trying to remember. And the more I remembered, the stranger some things felt. Not dramatic things. Small things. Moments I hadn't questioned at the time. Like the evening I asked why one of our savings accounts had less money than expected. Ethan answered immediately. Temporary transfer. Oh, it'll be back by next month. I accepted that explanation without another question. There had been dozens of conversations like that, maybe hundreds. Every concern had an answer, every discrepancy had an explanation, and every explanation sounded reasonable, at least back then. One afternoon at work, I found myself distracted during a design meeting. Olivia? I looked up. My colleague Mia was staring at me. You with us? The room laughed. I smiled. Sorry, long week. The meeting continued, but my attention kept drifting. Not toward Ethan, toward myself. I was starting to question memories I'd never questioned before. Had I trusted him because everything made sense, or because I wanted it to? That realization bothered me more than anything Tom had said. I didn't like feeling naive. Nobody does. The following week, work became busy again. Deadlines, client meetings, site visits. For a while, it helped. Normal life has a way of pushing uncomfortable thoughts into the background. Then, Friday afternoon arrived. I was reviewing project notes when an email notification appeared on my screen. The subject line caught my attention immediately. Community Development Project Selection. I sat up straighter. For months, my firm had been competing for that project, a major community center development, the kind of contract that could open doors for years. I clicked the email, read the first sentence, then the second. My stomach dropped. The project had been awarded to another firm. I sat back in my chair. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. A few minutes later, my phone rang. It was one of the committee members. His voice sounded uncomfortable before he even started talking. And that was the first sign this wasn't simply about losing the bid. Olivia, I wanted to call you personally. The committee member sounded uncomfortable. I already knew I hadn't gotten the project. The email sitting on my screen had made that clear. Still, something in his voice told me there was more. I appreciate that, I said. Can I ask what happened? A brief silence followed. Your proposal was one of the strongest. That wasn't an answer. People usually said things like that right before giving a disappointing one. Then why didn't we get it? I heard him exhale. There were concerns. I almost laughed. Concerns. The safest word in business. What kind of concerns? Another pause. Some members of the board felt there could be reputational risks. There it was. Not budget concerns. Not design concerns. Not experience concerns. Something else. Something I'd been carrying around for years. Are we talking about my divorce? His silence answered before he did. Not directly, he said carefully, but certain past controversies were discussed. I closed my eyes for a second. 5 years later, and it was still following me. I'm sorry, Olivia. The frustrating part was that he sounded sincere. When the call ended, I sat at my desk staring at the screen. That project would have opened a lot of doors. Instead, I lost it because of a story people still believed. A knock interrupted my thoughts. Mia stepped into my office. You okay? I've had better afternoons. She sat down across from me. I gave her the short version, the project, the phone call, the rumors. By the time I finished, she looked genuinely shocked. Wait, people still believe that? Apparently. That's ridiculous. Maybe it was, but it was also real. For years I'd convinced myself the damage wasn't that serious. The call proved otherwise. People hadn't forgotten. They'd simply stopped mentioning it in front of me. That evening, I met 2 close friends, Rachel and Kevin, for dinner. They noticed something was wrong almost immediately. What happened? Rachel asked. I told them everything. When I finished, Kevin leaned back in disbelief. So they basically admitted your reputation cost you the project? Not in those exact words. But close enough. Rachel shook her head. Olivia, this isn't normal. I laughed. It feels pretty normal now. No. She pointed her fork at me. The fact that it feels normal is the problem. That hit harder than I expected. Because she was right. Somewhere along the way, I'd adapted to it. I'd accepted things I never should have accepted. I kept waiting for the truth to fix everything on its own. Instead, the rumors stayed, and my silence made them easier to ignore. The conversation drifted to other topics for a while. Work, family, weekend plans, normal life. Then Kevin looked at me. Have you ever talked to a lawyer? I immediately shook my head. No. Why? Because I don't want a legal battle. Rachel raised an eyebrow. Olivia, you've already been fighting one. You're just the only person who hasn't been participating. I opened my mouth to argue. Nothing came out. For the first time, I wondered if staying quiet had been a mistake. Kevin pulled out his phone. I know someone. I laughed. Of course you do. I'm serious. He scrolled for a moment before turning the screen toward me. Her name's Eleanor Price. She handled a defamation case for my company a few years ago. I looked at the name. Rachel nodded immediately. I've heard of her. That surprised me. You have? She's good. Kevin slid the phone across the table. You don't have to hire her. I stared at the name for a few seconds. Eleanor Price. Just talk to her, Kevin said. You don't have to do anything after that. Rachel nodded. At least find out what your options are. I slipped the phone onto the table and sighed. Part of me wanted to dismiss the idea immediately. Lawyers meant conflict. Conflict meant attention. And attention was the last thing I'd wanted for years. But another part of me kept thinking about the project I'd just lost. The opportunity wasn't coming back. Neither were the countless smaller opportunities I'd probably never even known about. By the time dinner ended, I still hadn't made a decision. Yet somehow, 2 days later, I found myself sitting in the waiting area of Eleanor Price's office. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years avoiding confrontation. Now I was voluntarily meeting a defamation attorney. A receptionist led me into a conference room. A few minutes later, Eleanor walked in carrying a folder and a tablet. She looked to be in her late 40s, professional without being intimidating, confident without feeling arrogant. She shook my hand. "Olivia, thanks for coming. Thanks for seeing me." We sat down. The first 20 minutes felt less like a legal consultation and more like a conversation. She asked about my career, my divorce, the rumors, the community project, the fundraiser, Diane, Ethan. By the time I finished, she had several pages of notes. Then she leaned back slightly. "Let me ask a simple question." "Okay. Do you believe people have been expressing opinions about you or presenting facts about you?" I frowned. "I'm not sure I understand." "Most people don't." She smiled slightly. "Because legally, those are very different things." That got my attention. Eleanor picked up a pen. "If someone says, 'I don't trust Olivia,' that's an opinion." I nodded. "If someone says, 'Olivia stole money from her family,' that's a factual claim." "Even if it's false?" "Especially if it's false." That distinction had never occurred to me before. For years, I'd lumped everything together: rumors, opinions, gossip, accusations. To me, it all felt like the same problem. Eleanor clearly saw it differently. She flipped through her notes. "Tell me something. Has Ethan's family specifically claimed that you caused their financial losses?" "Yes." "Repeatedly?" "Yes." "In front of other people?" I laughed once. "Many people." She nodded as if that answer wasn't surprising. Then she asked something I wasn't expecting. "Have those claims caused measurable harm?" "What do you mean?" "Lost business, lost contracts, professional damage, financial consequences." Immediately, I thought about the community center project. Then the business association contacts that disappeared, the invitations that stopped coming, the opportunities that quietly vanished. "I think so." Eleanor gave me a look. "Think so or no so?" I hesitated. Then I told her about the phone call from the project committee member. The reputational concerns. The past controversies. The contract I'd lost. When I finished, she was writing quickly. Finally, she set down her pen. "That's important." For the first time since arriving, I felt something unexpected. Hope, small, careful, but real. Not because Eleanor promised anything. She hadn't. In fact, she was being extremely cautious. What gave me hope was that she wasn't treating the situation like meaningless gossip. She was treating it like something that mattered, something real. "Do you think I have a case?" I asked. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I think you may." The word may wasn't exactly thrilling. Still, it was more encouragement than I'd received in years. "But," she added, "a potential case and a successful case are two different things." "Meaning? We would need evidence?" Of course, nothing about this was going to be simple. Eleanor closed the folder. Then her expression became more serious. "Before you make any decisions, there's something you need to understand." I sat up straighter. "If you pursue this, everything becomes discoverable." "Everything?" "Potentially." My stomach tightened. She continued. "Your finances, your marriage, communications, records, decisions. People may be questioned under oath." The room suddenly felt much quieter. Eleanor folded her hands on the table. "This isn't just about proving what they said?" She held my gaze. "It's about being prepared for your entire past to be examined." Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she asked the question that stayed with me long after the meeting ended. "Olivia, are you ready for that?" I wish I could tell you I answered immediately. I didn't. I sat there looking at Eleanor while a dozen different thoughts ran through my head. For years, I'd wanted people to stop talking about me. Filing a lawsuit would guarantee the opposite. The meeting ended without a decision. Eleanor didn't pressure me. She simply handed me a folder. "Take your time. I appreciate that. Just remember," she said, Doing nothing is also a decision. That sentence followed me all the way home. It followed me through the rest of the week, too. Every time I considered letting the whole thing go, I thought about the community project, the fundraiser, Diane, the years of rumors, and the fact that none of it had actually stopped. One evening I called Rachel. I think I'm overthinking this. You've been overthinking it for 5 years. That's not helpful. It's not supposed to be. I laughed despite myself. Rachel grew quiet for a moment. What's really stopping you? The answer came out before I could filter it. I'm afraid. Of losing? No. I stared out the window. Of finding out how many people actually believed them. Rachel didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice softened. Olivia, I think you already know the answer to that. Unfortunately, she was right. A few days later, I was back in Eleanor's office. This time, I didn't need a long discussion. She looked at me and immediately knew. You've made a decision. I nodded. Yes. Eleanor opened a notebook. Then let's talk about what happens next. The process was slower and more detailed than I expected. Names, dates, conversations, witnesses, specific statements. She wanted everything. Not assumptions, not rumors, facts. The deeper we went, the more I realized how many times the same accusation had been repeated over the years. By Ethan, by Diane, by a few relatives, by people who probably never questioned where the story came from. Eventually, I looked up from my notes. Wait. Eleanor paused. What is it? I thought this was about Ethan. It is? I pointed at another name on the list. Then why are we talking about them? Because repeating a false statement can create liability too. That was the moment I understood something important. This wasn't just about one person. The story had survived because multiple people kept feeding it. Weeks later, the paperwork was officially filed. I expected relief. Instead, I felt sick. Not because I regretted it, because it was real now. There was no taking it back. By the end of the week, people were already talking. News travels fast in small communities. Legal news travels even faster. At work, a few coworkers suddenly became awkward around me. Not rude, just cautious, like they weren't sure what to say. One afternoon, I walked into the break room and 2 conversations immediately stopped. That told me everything I needed to know. At the same time, something unexpected started happening. People quietly reached out. An old client sent me a message. A former volunteer from a community project emailed me. Even Rebecca from the fundraiser called. I heard about the lawsuit. I smiled. I'm guessing everyone has. She laughed. Probably. Then her tone changed. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. It wasn't a dramatic moment, but after years of hearing silence, simple support felt surprisingly meaningful. Not everyone agreed, though. A few days later, I received a message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. The message was short. You're making a mistake. Let it go. No signature, no explanation. Just those words. I showed it to Eleanor. She barely reacted. People don't like change. That's your professional opinion? She smiled. My professional opinion is that people get nervous when old stories are challenged. That answer stayed with me, because the lawsuit wasn't changing the past. It was forcing people to look at it again. And apparently, some of them didn't like that. Then, much sooner than Eleanor expected, Ethan finally responded. I was sitting in her office when she received the documents. She skimmed the first few pages, then handed them to me. What does it say? Eleanor leaned back in her chair. He denies everything. That part wasn't surprising. What else? A faint smile appeared on her face. Not amusement. More like disbelief. Ethan claims every statement he made was true. I looked down at the paperwork. My stomach tightened. Then Eleanor added one more sentence. And according to him, he has the records to prove it. I stared at Eleanor. Part of me wanted to be nervous. Another part was simply confused. If Ethan really had proof, why had nobody ever seen it? For years, every accusation had sounded exactly the same. Olivia ruined our finances. Olivia drained the savings. Olivia caused the losses. But whenever I asked for specifics, the conversation always seemed to end there. Now Ethan was finally claiming he had evidence. Eleanor didn't look concerned. She looked focused. "What's your reaction?" she asked. "I honestly don't know." "Good." I blinked. "Good?" You'd be surprised how many people immediately assume they know what's inside documents they've never seen. That was fair. The legal process moved forward. Requests were exchanged. Documents were requested. Deadlines were set. For the first time, this wasn't a community rumor or a family argument. It was a formal legal dispute. Everything had to be supported. Everything had to be documented. A few weeks later, Eleanor called. "We received their production." "Their what?" She laughed. "The documents." That got my attention. I arrived at her office that afternoon. Several boxes sat near a conference table. Printed statements, financial records, investment reports, years of paperwork. Seeing it all in one place felt strange. During my marriage, I probably couldn't have gathered half of those records if I tried. Ethan handled everything: the budgets, the investments, the transfers, the explanations. Now all of it was sitting in front of us. Eleanor introduced me to a financial analyst named Mark. He would be helping review the records. Mark looked exactly like someone who enjoyed spreadsheets. Quiet, methodical, not particularly interested in drama, which was probably why Eleanor trusted him. He opened one of the folders. "At first glance, they've provided a lot. Is that good or bad?" "Neither." He shrugged. "It just means we have work to do." Over the next few days, I continued focusing on my job while Eleanor's team reviewed the records. Occasionally, she'd send updates. Most of them sounded frustratingly ordinary. Nothing significant yet. Still reviewing. Need more time. Large volume of documents. I tried to stay patient. It wasn't easy. One afternoon, Rachel called. "Any news?" "Not really." "So we're still waiting?" "Pretty much." She laughed. "Legal drama is a lot less exciting than television." That was definitely true. Most of the process involved paperwork and waiting. But beneath that routine, tension was building. Because eventually someone would have to explain where the money actually went. And this time, explanations wouldn't be enough. The records would have to match. A few days later, Eleanor invited me back to her office. The moment I walked into the conference room, I noticed something different. Mark was there. Several files were spread across the table. Nobody looked relaxed. That immediately got my attention. I sat down. "What's going on?" Eleanor exchanged a quick glance with Mark. The kind of glance professionals make when they're still deciding how much to say. Finally, Mark spoke. "We found something." My stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" He flipped through several pages. "At this point, I can't tell you exactly what it means." That wasn't the answer I wanted. But there are transactions I didn't expect to see. Eleanor leaned forward. "Unusual transactions." I looked from one of them to the other. "Unusual how?" Mark tapped a section of a report. "There are transfers that don't seem consistent with the explanation Ethan's team is presenting." For a second, nobody spoke. The room suddenly felt much quieter. "Could it be a mistake?" I asked. "It could be a lot of things." Mark closed the file. "That's why I need more time." "How much time?" "A little." He stood and gathered several documents. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. "I want to trace every movement connected to these accounts before I reach any conclusions." Eleanor nodded. "Do it." Mark picked up the folder and headed toward the door. Just before leaving, he paused. Then he looked back at us. Because if these transfers are what I think they might be, we're looking at a very different financial story than the one Ethan has been telling. That sentence stayed in my head for days. Unfortunately, legal investigations move on their own schedule. Not mine, not Ethan's, not anyone's. So I waited. I went to work, met with clients, reviewed plans, answered emails. On the surface, life looked normal. Underneath, I checked my phone far more often than I wanted to admit. Then Eleanor finally called. "Can you come in?" Her tone wasn't dramatic. That somehow made me more nervous. When I arrived, Mark was already sitting in the conference room. Several spreadsheets were spread across the table. He looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from staring at numbers for too long. Eleanor closed the door. Nobody started with small talk. That was my first clue. Mark slid a document toward me. "I think we've identified the transfers." I looked down. Rows of dates, account numbers, transaction records, mostly meaningless to me. "What am I looking at?" Mark pointed to several entries. "Money moving out of joint accounts." I frowned. "Our accounts?" He nodded. "Accounts that appear to have been shared during your marriage." I stared at the page. "Where did it go?" Mark exchanged a glance with Eleanor. Then he answered, "An investment account." I waited. Okay. Neither of them said anything. Then it clicked. An investment account I didn't know about? That's what we're trying to verify. My stomach tightened. I looked back at the records. The numbers weren't small, not even close. Large enough to matter, large enough to affect a family's financial stability. Large enough that I would have remembered approving them, except I didn't. I looked up. "Are you saying Ethan hid money?" Eleanor immediately shook her head. "We're not saying that." Mark nodded in agreement. "We're saying money was transferred." That distinction mattered, at least legally. Emotionally, it was harder, because memories were already starting to shift. I found myself remembering conversations from years earlier, moments that seemed insignificant at the time, questions about account balances, unexpected shortages, plans that were suddenly postponed. Every time Ethan had an explanation ready: investment timing, market conditions, temporary adjustments. Back then, I believed him. Why wouldn't I? He was the financial expert. I was his wife. Mark continued walking us through the records, patiently, methodically. Unlike Diane or Ethan, the documents weren't trying to persuade anyone. They simply existed. Numbers, dates, transfers, facts. By the end of the meeting, I felt strangely exhausted. Not because we had discovered everything, because we hadn't. There were still gaps, still unanswered questions, still records being traced. But one thing was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. There had been financial activity I knew absolutely nothing about. When the meeting ended, I remained seated. Eleanor noticed. "You okay?" I laughed softly. I'm trying to figure out whether I should be shocked. And I think I am. That earned a small smile. That's a reasonable reaction. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Eleanor gathered several papers. The movement caught my attention. One page had been separated from the others, a timeline. I pointed at it. "What's that?" Mark looked over. "Just a chronology of major transactions." I wasn't planning to study it. Then one date caught my eye. A very specific date. One I remembered, because it was around the same period Ethan first started talking about our financial problems. I leaned closer. "Wait." Mark stopped. "What is it?" I pointed to the page. The transfer had happened months earlier, before the arguments became frequent. Before Ethan started telling family members we were struggling. Before anyone began suggesting my projects were causing problems. The room grew quiet. I looked at the date again to make sure I wasn't mistaken. I wasn't. Then I looked up at Eleanor. "If this timeline is correct..." She already knew where I was going. The expression on her face confirmed it. Because the money wasn't moved after the blame started. According to the records, it had been moved before Ethan ever began blaming me for the losses. Nobody rushed to draw conclusions. That was one thing I'd learned from working with Eleanor's team. They cared about evidence, not assumptions. Still, the timeline was becoming difficult to ignore. Over the following weeks, more records were reviewed. More accounts were traced. More transactions were matched against dates and statements Ethan had made over the years, and the picture slowly became clearer. Not all at once. Piece by piece. One afternoon, I sat across from Mark while he walked me through another report. He pointed at several pages. These appear to be investment positions. I looked at the numbers. Most of it meant very little to me. What does that mean in plain English? Mark smiled slightly. It means money was invested. Successfully? The smile disappeared. Not exactly. That answer told me enough. He turned a few pages. Several of these investments lost substantial value. I stared at the report. How substantial? Mark named a figure. For a second, I genuinely thought I'd heard him wrong. I hadn't. The amount was enormous. Large enough to explain problems we'd experienced during the marriage. Large enough to affect long-term savings. Large enough that nobody could reasonably call it insignificant. I leaned back in my chair. So the losses were real? Yes. Just not where everyone claimed they came from. Mark nodded. That's what the records currently suggest. The words currently suggest mattered. Nothing was final yet. But the direction was becoming increasingly obvious. What disturbed me most wasn't the losses. Investments fail all the time. What bothered me was something else. The timing, the explanations, the story that followed. The more documents we reviewed, the harder it became to reconcile Ethan's public narrative with the actual financial records. At one point, Eleanor spread several timelines across a conference table. One showed account activity. Another showed investment losses. A third documented major events during the marriage. When viewed together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Certain financial problems appeared before Ethan started blaming me, not after. For years, I'd wondered whether I had somehow missed something, whether I'd been careless, whether I bore responsibility I simply didn't want to acknowledge. Those doubts were starting to disappear. Not because someone reassured me, because the records existed. And records don't care about feelings. A few days later, Eleanor called unexpectedly. Her tone was different. Not excited. Alert. Has anyone contacted you? The question caught me off guard. Who? Anyone connected to Ethan? I thought for a moment. No. Okay. She paused. If that changes, let me know. That conversation made more sense 2 days later. I was leaving work when my phone rang. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. Normally, I would have ignored it. For some reason, I answered. Hello? A brief silence followed. Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in years. Olivia? I stopped walking. Vanessa. Of all people, Vanessa. The former friend who had quietly become part of Ethan's life before my divorce was even finalized. For a moment, neither of us knew what to say. Finally, she spoke. You probably don't want to hear from me. That was true, but curiosity won. What do you want, Vanessa? She sounded nervous. Genuinely nervous. Not defensive. Not arrogant. Not like the woman I remembered. I wanted to talk. About what? Another pause, long enough to make me glance around the parking lot. People were walking to their cars, completely unaware that one of the strangest phone calls of my life was happening. About the lawsuit. There it was. I leaned against my car. What about it? Vanessa lowered her voice. Olivia, maybe this has gone far enough. I almost laughed. 5 years of accusations, 5 years of damage. And now it had gone far enough? What exactly are you asking? She hesitated. Then came the first crack in her composure. Maybe there's another way to resolve this. Such as? No answer. Just breathing on the other end of the line. I waited. Eventually she spoke again, and this time she sounded scared. Not concerned. Scared. Please. The word barely came out above a whisper. Before more documents become public, please consider stopping this. I stood beside my car, holding my phone a little tighter. For years, Vanessa hadn't reached out once. Now she sounded scared. Why? I asked. A long pause followed. Because this is going to hurt a lot of people. I almost laughed. For 5 years, I had been the one living with the consequences. Now that the truth was getting closer, everyone suddenly seemed worried about damage. Goodbye, Vanessa. I ended the call. The case moved forward. There were depositions, financial reviews, witness statements, and endless paperwork. Nothing about it felt dramatic. Mostly, it was people being forced to answer questions they had avoided for years, especially Ethan. One afternoon, Eleanor laid several reports across a conference table. The records finally painted a complete picture. The transfers, the investment accounts, the losses, the timelines, everything connected. And the more evidence appeared, the harder it became for Ethan's story to survive. For years, people had repeated the same claim, that I had drained our savings through personal projects. But when the time came to prove it, there was nothing. No records, no transactions, no reports, no evidence at all. Then the focus shifted to Ethan's investments. The same investments nobody ever mentioned when they talked about our divorce. Those records showed significant losses. More importantly, they showed that Ethan knew about those losses long before he started blaming me. The dates matched. The account activity matched. The testimony matched. The story I'd been carrying for 5 years simply didn't match the facts. I looked across the room at Ethan. For the first time, he looked less like a confident professional and more like someone running out of explanations. A few seats behind him sat Diane. She didn't say much during the proceedings. Neither did I. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden confessions, just evidence. And evidence turned out to be louder than rumors. When the ruling finally arrived, my heart was pounding so hard I barely heard the opening remarks. Then I heard what mattered. The court found that the accusations against me were not supported by evidence. The ruling acknowledged that false statements had damaged my reputation and affected professional opportunities. Real harm had occurred. I sat there quietly for a moment, not celebrating, just breathing. Eleanor smiled and touched my arm. We did it. I nodded. That was enough. Outside the courthouse, people immediately started talking. Only this time, the conversation was different. Some people apologized. Some avoided me completely. Others acted as if they had never believed the rumors. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. But something important changed. The weight I'd been carrying wasn't mine anymore. In the weeks that followed, Ethan lost credibility with people who had trusted his version of events. Questions started being directed at him instead of me. And Diane stopped talking publicly about the divorce altogether. One afternoon, I was reviewing design plans in my office when my phone rang. The caller ID caught my attention immediately. It was the organization behind the community development project I had lost months earlier. The same project that had slipped away while my reputation was still under a cloud. I answered. The conversation lasted only a few minutes. When it ended, I sat quietly at my desk. They wanted to meet. They were reconsidering my firm. Not because of sympathy. Not because of the lawsuit. Because they believed in my work. I set the phone down and looked around my office. For years, introducing myself came with an invisible disclaimer. I always wondered what people had heard, what they believed, what I might need to explain. Sitting there, I realized something. The biggest victory wasn't the court ruling. It wasn't the documents. It wasn't even being proven right. It was knowing that when people met me, they could finally meet me first instead of a rumor. Sometimes the truth takes far longer to catch up than it should. But when it finally does, it has a way of exposing things that stories and gossip never can. If this story connected with you, feel free to share it with someone who might understand. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and whether you've ever had to clear your name after being judged unfairly. And if you enjoy these real-life drama stories, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next story.